Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Ko Barry Kosaho, ko te karahi o te patea whaitakauro. Uh, Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tihei Mōri ora. So a very warm welcome to you all. I'm Barry Coates. I'm founder and CEO of Mindful Money. We're a charity that basically encourages ethical, responsible, and impact investing. And we're going to explain a lot more about those terms during the seminar. So thanks very much for joining us. This is one of a series of seminars, and they're generally held on Wednesdays at 12:15. So you can check on our website for videos and podcasts of previous seminars. There's some really great ones on the website, so encourage you to have a look around those. Today we're starting from the start, where where we haven't always done so. We've for a long time wanted to do a seminar which is more like a kind of an introduction to ethical investing, and in a way what people should know before you kind of go down the journey towards ethical investing, but also things you need to know if you're new to KiwiSaver or if you're relatively new to investing at all. So this is by way of a kind of like an ethical investing 101. And we kind of would love to have your feedback and comments afterwards on it, and certainly any questions. So this is very much a kind of primer, and we'd love you to kind of come back and quiz us on stuff we're not covering or not covering well enough. In order to help us along the journey, we have invited someone to represent a kind of relatively new KiwiSaver investor, although I think she actually knows a lot more than that. So it's a warm welcome to Ayla Barfoot. Ayla is the Network Engagement Manager for SBN, and her job is to work closely with SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, to get them started on their sustainability journey. So it's a really nice link into what we're talking about today, which is about kind of where you put your money. And we're particularly talking about the investment side of where you put your money rather than the banking side. So, Ayla, a very warm welcome to you.
Kia ora, Barry. Thank you.
I hope this kind of isn't too tricky an assignment for you, because, as I said, I think you know a bit more about this than the questions you're asking. But thank you very much for doing it.
No, you're welcome. It's a great place for businesses to start thinking and individuals as well. So really good to have an introductory section.
Great. Why don't you kick us off with a curly question?
Perfect. Okay, so first up, what is KiwiSaver and how does it work?
Ooh, tough ones. So KiwiSaver is a scheme set up by the government, and it intends to boost people's savings, and particularly savings for retirement, which is the whole focus of it. The money for the KiwiSaver comes from contributions from your employer, generally up to 3% of your salary, and that's matched by the government. So essentially what's happening is that 6% of your salary is going into your KiwiSaver, and your employer is bound to do that. It's a requirement for them to do that. So here's the facts. At the end of last year, about 3.2 million Kiwis had over 64 billion invested in KiwiSaver. That's actually up to 90 billion now. So this is growing rapidly. It's a huge fund, and it can be used for two things. One is for your retirement when you turn 65, and secondly, if you want to buy your first house, and it can give you a contribution towards the deposit on the house. And the final thing to know about KiwiSaver, it's a fund that invests in companies. So typically what your fund does is it takes your money, pulls it together with a whole lot of other people's money, and invests that in a lot of companies. So we'll come on to more details further on.
Great, thank you. So when you join KiwiSaver, how do you choose which fund your money goes into?
There's a couple of ways, and it's a kind of important decision. But most people, when they start work, don't really have much information about what they're choosing, and so people often get into a KiwiSaver fund just because somebody mentioned something or because their employer recommended it. Um, what you should do is you should kind of take the time to look at what fund is best for you. Um, you can choose and then you can switch later. So it's not something you have to stay in for life. You can choose a KiwiSaver fund and then it's free for you to switch that fund. If you don't choose a fund proactively, you might end up in one that your employer nominates for you, or that's what's called a default fund, where the government has kind of a list of 6 funds that they put you into if you don't choose one yourself. It's much, much better to choose proactively because then you've got a chance of choosing a KiwiSaver fund which is right for you and your needs.
Right. So if I'm going to think about changing funds, but how do I find out which KiwiSaver fund I'm currently in?
Well, one of the ways you can do that is by uh, going to the Inland Revenue Department. You can call them, or you can go to the My IRD uh, sort of function, website for those of you who have already registered with the IRD, and you can find out very easily there. Otherwise, give them a call, tell them your name, they'll ask you a bit of information, and then they'll be able to tell you. It's the IRD that kind of manages the money, and one of the advantages of KiwiSaver is that it's pretty well regulated. So the chances of somebody kind of taking your money and running off with it are relatively low because it's a really well regulated government scheme. It's not like a dodgy investment scheme where you don't know kind of who it is who's investing your money. In fact, with KiwiSaver, it's all pretty well regulated.
Yeah, that's great for peace of mind. And so then what should I start to think about when I'm choosing a fund?
It's a good question, and um, when most people kind of choose a fund because they want to earn some money from it. So they're interested in a financial return. You can go to places like the Mindful Money website, and we'll show you in a minute kind of what the Mindful Money website does. But you can look up the past returns. So what a fund has earned in terms of its financial return, or kind of like an interest rate, uh, in the past, and that's kind of important. Is not a good necessarily a good guide to what's going to happen in the future, but a lot of people think it's important to understand which funds have been doing well and which haven't. So past returns is one thing. You can go for a fund that has lower fees on the basis that you don't need to pay so much out to the people who administer your money. And that can be important to people, although you should also think about what the net returns are, because some funds have higher fees, but actually they use that to be able to generate higher returns. So often it's kind of net returns that's more important necessarily than just the level of fees. Most importantly, you should look at risks. Where and risks are about uh, when you want your money out and how much risk you're prepared to take. So if you're about to put down a deposit on the house and maybe it's a year away and the markets kind of the financial markets are going up and down as they are at the moment, you may want to be quite cautious and put your money into what's called a conservative fund where it's a bit safer, or even a cash fund. um, if you kind of recognize that maybe you've already put down that first house deposit and your money's sitting there for 10, 20, 30 years until you retire at 65, then that's a very long time, and you're probably going to want to be more um, risky with what you invest in, because the law of kind of about finances, the more risk you take on, the higher return, the higher financial return you can generally expect, and vice versa. If you're in a conservative fund, you generally can expect a low return. If you're an aggressive fund or a growth fund, you can generally expect a higher return. So that risk profile that you want to invest in is a really important decision, and you can change it over time. You can switch which fund you're in. Again, generally that's absolutely free to do. And we'll come back to kind of when you should switch and when you shouldn't. The final thing to look at, so past returns, fees, risk. The other thing that we'll talk a lot about here is what's the kind of consequence of your decision on people, on the planet, and on the climate. It's whatever you do with your investment has consequences. So what we're going to be talking about through this seminar is a little bit about how you work out what those decisions are that have a kind of an ethical or sustainability consequence.
Perfect. So I've heard lots in the media at the moment about changes in the economic system, potentially heading for a recession, and I've heard the term locking in my losses. So is now an okay time to switch, or will I be locking in my losses?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ayla. This um, the term locking in your losses comes from when the share market goes down and you're in something like a risky fund, like a growth fund. Often your fund will lose money temporarily. Uh, if you then say, "Oh my gosh, I'm losing money. I'm going to switch to a much safer fund or a term deposit, interest rate deposit," then you're often um, kind of what's called locking in your losses. So you're kind of not getting the bounce back that usually comes as a result of these share markets. So um, markets go up and down, but if you look over a long period of time, generally a growth fund will increase by somewhere between 7 and 9%. A balanced fund a bit less, a conservative fund a bit less, but over a long period of time, there is a positive kind of rate of return. So if you kind of sell out when the market's gone down, you're in danger of kind of locking your losses before the fund bounces back and recovers those losses through future gains. So it means that you should be a bit patient with your investment. The important thing is that you can switch within the same category. If you're in a kind of growth fund and your money goes down a bit, you can still switch as long as you switch to another growth fund, because that fund has kind of the same sort of exposure to the same kind of risky companies. And so you're not locking in your losses if you switch between funds at the same risk level. So that's important for people who may go out and want to say, I want to invest ethically, but I'm worried about locking in my losses. Well, you don't if you invest in the same risk category. Kind of complicated, but I hope that gets the message across.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. If you're playing the long game, you can switch between, but stick to the long game, short game, stay in the short game, but switch to a different fund in the same category. Yeah, great.
Exactly.
Okay, so now we're going to go a little bit deeper into this idea of ethical investment. So, what is ethical investment? What does that mean?
For one thing, the terminology around this is not very clear. So some people talk about ethical investment, other people talk about responsible investment or sustainable investment. Essentially, it's the same kind of concept. What you're trying to do is you're trying to invest in ways that aren't going to invest in companies that destroy the planet, harm their employees or local communities or violate human rights, etc. So you're trying to avoid the bad stuff, but you also kind of are interested in helping companies to raise their standards and be more ethical or more socially and environmentally sound, and you're trying to invest in more of those good companies. So generally, that's the area of ethical investment. It's often pretty imprecise because the definitions tend to shift around depending on who's using it. And the government hasn't set strong standards on what is actually meant by ethical investment. However, most people kind of understand enough about the concept to be able to say, okay, I can kind of I can think clearly enough about knowing what I think is ethical. And it is ultimately up to you and your values, because everyone has different values. And what's your ethical investment may be different to other people. However, there's one other thing to remember about that. Most people in New Zealand have some similarity in the kind of values that they apply to their investment. And we do annual surveys on this. And it's astounding that over 5 years, the same things keep on coming up. So people want to avoid investing in companies that violate human rights, or they want to avoid cruelty to animals, or they want to avoid investing in fossil fuels, or avoiding investing in weapons. Those kind of issues are common across New Zealanders. And there are other issues for which there are much more differences of opinion. But those kind of things are very much in common, where people want to avoid the same kind of things in their investment. So that's the kind of thing about ethical investment. It is specific to your values, but actually across New Zealanders as a whole, there's a lot of commonality around these ethical issues.
Right. So just a follow-on question there. If we're talking about ethical investing, one is the reason that it doesn't have a regulation of what that means because it's quite a new thing.
Yeah. Yeah, in a way, it has been around for a long time. So for example, many people may know that there was a big public movement for companies to take their money out of South Africa during apartheid. Or there was, even before that, there was a Christian faith movement around taking your money out of companies that engage in slavery. So, these kind of ethical decisions around investment have been around for centuries. What's happened is that recently they've become much more mainstream as people have kind of cottoned on to the issues of sustainability. Social and environmental issues have become more important, particularly climate change has become an issue. So it's become much, much more common for people to want this in their investment, and for the investment industry to come up with ways to offer it. So what's happened is that the regulations haven't really caught up with that, although there are stronger regulations in many other overseas countries. So, for example, in the EU, there are now some ways to define ethical investment that are quite grounded in specific standards. We haven't got those in New Zealand yet, and it's one of the things that we're calling for from the government.
Right, that's good to hear. Okay, so if we've got all this understanding now of what ethical investment is, how do I know if my funds are ethical?
Yeah, let me pass on to my colleague Olive for this one, because she's going to show you through a good way to check. Olive's a communications marketing manager for Mindful Money, and she's a fantastic explainer of these things. So over to you, Olive.
Sure. Hi. I'll take you through the website and what we've created so you can actually see where your money is going. All right, so to check your fund and where your money is going, first of all, you go over to the funds checker. So we, just to give a bit of background about what Mindful Money is and what we do, we are an independent charity. So we do this research so you don't need to. All you need to do is come in and know your KiwiSaver fund name. So for example's sake, I'm going to use the biggest fund in New Zealand, which is the ANZ Growth Fund. But as you can see before that, there's a whole list. So you can just go down if you think you're with your bank or whatnot, just have a wee look. So all you need to know is that, and then jump through, and then we'll give you exactly how much of a percentage is in each different category of concern. So alcohol for this fund, for example, is 2%. Then you have animal cruelty at 5.8, fossil fuels, gambling, human rights, environmental violations, as well as weapons. So if you go through to the fund details, you'll actually get the name of the companies. So you can have a look through. So there might be some companies you personally recognize, potentially like Nestle, and some different fossil fuel companies, but there's a whole lot you probably don't. But we've categorized them into these different categories of what they do and what harm they do. So this is what our team of researchers do. We're actually the only country in the world that can do this at the moment. Yeah, so have a look and have a think. Does this fit your personal values? Is this what you want your money to be supporting? Everyone's values are, of course, quite different.
Yeah, and as Olive said, these factors are kind of the issues of concern for New Zealanders. And again, we kind of know that because when we do annual surveys, this is what people say are the things that they want to avoid. And so, for example, 90% of New Zealanders want to avoid companies that violate human rights. And so what we do is we go out and do research globally on all of the companies that have a record of violating human rights. And there's some judgment calls in how we do that, but it's really well documented and it's subject to some pretty rigorous research. So, and we also, before we publish the information, we go back to all of the fund managers, there's kind of 800 funds on the website, and they kind of check out the information to ensure that that it's valid. So there's a few kind of validation steps in there.
So, if we've kind of got all this money in KiwiSaver, how much of an impact does KiwiSaver have on the world?
Yeah, this is a question I get quite often. A lot of people saying, well, I only have $1,000 in my KiwiSaver. What impact am I actually having? And collectively, the answer is quite a bit. There is about, I think it's $89 billion collectively in KiwiSaver invested in New Zealand. So that money stacks up pretty quickly when it's going into these areas of concern. So here's just like a little snapshot that we made based on the September 2022 data. We haven't quite done the 2023 data yet. We're going through that process at the moment. So you can see collectively there is $2.7 billion in fossil fuel companies. Animal testing and animal cruelty, there's 2.5 billion. Human rights and environmental abuses, that's 1.8 billion. Weapons production, these are not small amounts when it all adds up. So it is a very easy and quick way to make quite a big impact on the world, is to have a look where your money's going and then shift it if it doesn't fit your values.
Yeah, that's great. And like lots of sustainability things, the individual kind of contributions might feel small, but it's the collective action that we can have when we all do these little actions that makes the big difference. Great. So what are the key factors to consider when you're choosing an ethical investment?
Yeah, sure. I can, how about I take you through our fund finder, which kind of takes you through that process.
Yeah, great.
So back on the Mindful Money website, once you've gone through and you've had a look at your fund and find out if it doesn't fit your values or whatnot, we also have a fund finder. So it runs through 3 kind of basic questions. One is about what you personally want to avoid. So whether that be human rights, animal cruelties, weapons, fossil fuels, all the different things that have popped up before. So for sake of this, I'm just going to want to exclude them all. And then, so the second question is about what investment approach is most important to you. So there's 4 different things that you can rank in this one, and this affects the algorithm of what will be shown to you at the end. So it could be funds that have a policy to exclude those different industries that we just picked. It could be funds who engage with companies to raise their standards, or funds that generally have lower fees or higher past returns. So I'm going to leave it as it is, but what you can do is you can go in and choose this for yourself. So maybe you want to, maybe it is past returns, maybe it's engagement, you can choose. And then the third question is your risk profile. So that's going back to what Barry said previously about how long you want it in. There's a few other things. So your risk, your personal risk tolerance as well. So I personally would want my KiwiSaver in for a while because I'm not planning on retiring for a while. So I would go for the growth fund. And then what it would do is it would suggest different funds that meet those criteria. So these are also what we call mindful funds. So they've gone through the mindful And then you can see the past returns and then the different fees there. So once you want to have a look and research through these, I recommend just having a look at the fund details. You can see, so for this fund, there are still a little bit of companies of concern, but they're quite small amounts in there. And then you can find more information about the fund, about their risk profile, when they started, number of members, fees, etc., etc. There are different exclusions. So as you can see, they've got wide exclusions there. And then here's a nice graph about their past returns. So you can see that they've actually been above market average. So once you've had a look through all the different funds there and chosen the one that you want, say, I'm just going to pick one at random. I'm just going to go for this one. It will bring you to a fund referral page. So all you need to do is put in your first name, last name, and email, and it will drop you straight on the application page for that fund. So they will ask you for a few different bits of information, like I think you might need your date of birth, your PIR rate, which you can find on IRD. I'll put some information on the link about that as well. But you don't actually need a whole bunch of information because the IRD does it for you. You don't have to like go to your fund and be like, I'm leaving and move on. So Barry, do you have something to say?
You do need a passport or driver's license is the other thing.
License.
One or the other. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's actually really simple. It only takes like 15 minutes. The biggest thing I hear from people is like, oh gosh, it looks like such a process to switch a fund. Like I don't want to have to do the research and like all that kind of stuff. So that's why we created this tool, to make it super easy, super simple, to have all the information at hand to be able to make that switch or just invest based on your values.
Yeah, fantastic. And I can definitely vouch for this. I did this process years ago now, and it was so quick and so easy. And yeah, definitely would recommend having a look into it. Now that we've kind of done that background information, getting into more of the nitty-gritty sustainability questions, does my KiwiSaver have an impact on the climate?
So a lot of people don't kind of make the connection between what your money does and climate change. But if you think about it, your money in your KiwiSaver account or your investment account gets invested in businesses. So you can either invest in companies that do good things to the climate or destroy it. And so one of the things that you ought to do as an investor is you ought to think about the impact of your investment on the climate, because you can either be part of the problem or you can be part of the solution. And so if you're part of the problem, then maybe your money is kind of going a lot into fossil fuel companies, and particularly those fossil fuel companies that are still expanding their production, even though we urgently need to phase out our fossil fuels. And, piece of information, there's around 2/3 of the major fossil fuel companies are still expanding their production. So that's one thing you can do. You can invest in companies that are doing better things on the climate. Maybe they're kind of got lower emissions than other companies. And then the third thing you can do is you can actually invest in climate solutions. And increasingly now there are some options for investors to invest in renewable energy or the kind of companies that are actually producing climate solutions that will help reduce emissions. In future, you're probably also going to be able to invest in some companies that are good for resilience to the climate and will help a society like New Zealand to be able to respond to climate impacts. There's not a lot of those funds available now, but that's something that we're trying to encourage for the future. So the answer is, if you do your climate footprint, and most people kind of have a footprint of around 7 tons per person per year. So out of driving a car or hopping on an aeroplane or using electricity, etc., you emit around 7 tons as a person. But that doesn't count the amount you have in your investment. And for the average person, the average KiwiSaver, that's kind of around 2.5 tons. So it's significant compared to your total climate footprint. So what you want to do is you want to pay attention to your climate footprint. And there's some stuff on the Mindful Money website which will enable you to look at which funds you may want to choose to have a better impact on the climate.
Yeah, that is more significant than I thought it would be. And yeah, when it is such an easy switch, it's a great way to yeah, kind of tackle that. We always say every dollar you spend is a vote for the world that you want to be in. And so now it can be every dollar that you invest is also a vote for the world that you want to be in. A good way to think about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So another thing that's been in the media a lot recently is greenwashing. We're seeing that across lots of different industries. So does greenwashing affect the KiwiSaver and investment industry, and what do I look out for to avoid it?
Yeah, if you've ever kind of read the advertisements for KiwiSaver funds or other investment funds, it's all about they're sustainable, they're ethical, they do the right thing. And what you really have to do is you have to kind of look beyond the industry claims, and we'd love the government to crack down on some of these overinflated and exaggerated claims. Uh, but actually, as an investor, you can do some stuff yourself, and uh, probably the most important thing you can do is find out what's in your portfolio. Because if somebody says I'm sustainable, and then you find out they're investing in a whole lot of companies that produce fossil fuels and are expanding their production, then you have to say, well, actually, that doesn't sound right. So that's a kind of really simple step. There's also, as we talked about, certification. So there's a body called Responsible Investment Association of Australasia that has a certification for ethical funds, so you can look for that as well. And then, of course, you can look at which ones are deemed to be what's called mindful funds on our website, on the Mindful Money website, because those are the ones that have been through our criteria for saying which of the funds that meet the minimum standards for being ethical in their operations, according to Mindful Money's criteria.
Fantastic that there's a way to cut out some of that legwork we have to do as individuals by going through that system.
Yeah.
Great. So how do I balance my ethical concerns with my financial goals? And what are the fees associated with ethical investments compared to a traditional investment?
Yeah, I mean, it's this is a kind of an interesting one that actually, if you look at the information that's available kind of over 10-year period or longer, what you can see is that actually ethical investment has done really, really well in terms of financial returns. Even when you take the fact into account that sometimes they have slightly higher fees because they need to do research, they need to kind of engage with companies, they often have slightly higher fees, but actually, because they're investing in good companies, so companies for which sustainability is important, they're good brands and good customer loyalty, and their employees like them and motivated. There's a lot of reasons why sustainable companies are also companies that have good financial returns. So if you look at the evidence, then actually it's just as likely that your ethical funds are going to be, on average, at least as high a return, if not higher, than traditional investments. So it's kind of unlike buying organic eggs. You go and you try and buy organic eggs and you pay a lot more for them. It's not necessarily the same with ethical investment. Actually, you're often able to get your cake and eat it too. So you're able to invest ethically and you earn a good return that's often higher. So it's kind of that sweet spot. And it was interesting, the guy who's head of the biggest investment firm in the world said the question used to be, why invest ethically? But actually, with the financial returns from ethical investment, the question is, why wouldn't you invest ethically? I think that's kind of like a good thing to remember, that in many ways it's a good decision financially as well as good for the world.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. And it's always good to have both of those things, because sometimes sustainability can be seen as a expensive add-on, but there's lots of times when it's actually ticks all the boxes and is positive in all lights. So that's great. So with that question of why would someone not invest ethically? Why is this still happening?
A lot of it is because of the traditional ways that the finance industry is operated. And it's kind of interesting that there's a theory to say if you spread your money across lots of companies, then actually that what's called diversifies the risk away. And it's a valid theory, and you do need to kind of spread your investments. You don't necessarily need to do it over thousands of companies, but if you spread your investments, then you're less at risk of any one company falling over and losing money. But you also need to take account of these ethical factors. So if, for example, you invest in fossil fuels over a 10-year period, if you invest in fossil fuels on average, you would have lost money year on year. Whereas if you invested in a market average excluding those fossil fuel companies, then you would have made on average 10% per year. So there's a lot of reasons why investing ethically is, as we say, a good financial decision as well as a good ethical decision. One of the kind of short forms we use is you feel good about investing ethically, you do good in the world, and you earn good returns. Why not?
Win, win, win.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Sounds too easy, doesn't it, Ayla? You know,
Yeah, it does.
but
Sounds too good
actually,
to be true. But we've got to take
but
these easy wins.
exactly, you got to take particularly the ones that where you can progress sustainability and climate change for a positive benefit.
Yeah, that is fantastic. So this is we've talked a lot about overall and individual actions and things, but what do you think is the future for ethical and responsible investing?
So on the left, and sorry about the kind of detail, on the left is what you traditionally do, which is you ignore the impact of your investment on the environment and on society. If you move along, you go down to avoid harm, and that's where we've been talking about the issues of concern about investing weapons and fossil fuels and human rights violation. You can avoid those things. So now there are funds available that enable you to do that. If you move up to engage, what some fund managers do is that they say, oh, we'll avoid the worst of the companies, but we'll still maybe invest in those fossil fuel companies that are in transition on climate change, and we'll kind of push them further down the route. So we'll engage and influence them to go further on social and environmental issues. It's kind of a very valid strategy, but it has to kind of have results. It's not good enough to kind of ring up once a year and say, are you doing the right thing? Oh yeah, thanks, goodbye. That's not engagement. Actually there's a whole kind of set of actions that's required in order for that to happen. And then you move down to kind of better standards. You can invest in the companies that are really high standards. So, a nice example is Kathmandu, that has really good supply chains. They make sure that they don't abuse labor rights. They don't kind of buy into modern slavery, etc. So they're the kind of good companies, and you can invest in those. And then finally, you can do what's called impact investing. And that's kind of what we alluded to earlier on, where you invest in companies that do good in the world. And that's investing in social housing, which now some of the mainstream funds are starting to do. They're investing in, for example, a Salvation Army has a bond, a loan that these funds can invest in. And when they do, you get 118 houses in Auckland for people who otherwise don't have housing, and the government provides a subsidy for social housing. So it's a good financial deal as well as good for social equity. Or renewable energies is another example. So that's the impact investing side. That's kind of sweet spot. That's where people want to go. And the one problem in New Zealand is that we haven't got a lot of choice of funds that are available to you and I, the kind of retail investors. And it's one of the things Mindful Money and others are doing, is trying to encourage more of those funds to establish, so we have more choice around the really good funds that create positive benefits. So it's kind of, sorry to kind of end on a slightly techie note, but actually I think this is quite useful for people to understand the different things you can do in your investing.
Yes, definitely. And we talk about a lot in sustainability that, we've talked about sustainability for many, many years, and that's been fine, but we actually need to move beyond sustainability to regeneration. And that's kind of a similar concept, right? It's not just about not doing harm anymore, it's about repairing the harm that we've already created. So I think that's a great note to end on. And yeah, thank you so much. I really think that this was an information session that everyone should listen to. And where would people go to find out more information or get in touch with you guys?
So, we probably would say this, wouldn't we? But the Mindful Money website's a good place to start, www.mindfulmoney.nz. But there's also other places. I referred to this kind of Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, RIA. So they're a good place to go to as well. Particularly if you're concerned about kind of the way you look at your risk of your investment, there's a government website called Sorted, and they've got a really good kind of explanation of how you think through the risk of your investment and what kind of fund you may want to choose. We've got a shortened version of that on the Mindful Money website. So those are some good places to start off. You can also, for impact investing, we've got a directory up on Mindful Money website. There's also something called the Impact Investment Network that produces some materials. So they're good to contact. And above all, it's really good for you to kind of, in a way, feel empowered about actually finding out about this stuff and not being put off by the complicated language and the terminology and so on. The final thing to say is, if you've got a lot of money or if it's really complicated, you should think about going to see a financial advisor. They do charge fees, and so it tends to be suitable for people who have larger amounts to invest. But if you have, then on the Mindful Money website, we've got a list of the certified financial advisors who are specialists in ethical investing. So that's kind of where you can go and find out more.
Fantastic.
Ayla, thank you so much for joining us, and more power to you for your work at Sustainable Business Network. I should probably divulge my, not conflict of interest, but my interest, insofar as I'm a very enthusiastic and supportive board member for Sustainable Business Network. I think you guys do fabulous work.
Oh, well, thank you, Barry. Back at you.
Great, Ayla. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
And Olive, I think we just bring up a thank you to our sponsors. For this series, we're really grateful to. There's a fund called Alfinity, which has come to New Zealand from Australia. It's a really good fund. Medical Assurance Society, otherwise known as MAS, Mercer, and also the New Zealand Green Investment Finance, which invests in climate solutions. It's a government fund doing really interesting stuff. Silver sponsors Chapman Tripp, the law firm, do a lot of great stuff on sustainability. Boosters, one of the main ethical investment fund. Harbour Trustees Executor is what's called a supervisor of these funds, and are really kind of keen on these ethical investment issues. And finally, bronze sponsors are Pathfinder and Pi funds. So thanks to all of those. Thanks to those who are watching this kind of either live or online through kind of video sharing. Please share it with others. It's a really good one if you've got friends or kind of family or neighbors or others. Share it and help people kind of understand what they can do on this whole ethical investment issue. Be active, be informed, be empowered. Mate wa, thanks for joining us.